Why the healthcare directive you wrote might not work in the hospital. A bioethical perspective and toolkit to protect your clients. Hi, I'm Vicki Kind. I'm a clinical bioethicist and the author of The Caregiver's Path to Compassionate Decision-Making, Making Choices for Those Who Can't. I've also been a family caregiver for 4 members of my family for many years. I understand, both from a professional point of view and from the family's point of view, how difficult it is to make these medical decisions. As a clinical bioethicist, I'm often called in when there are healthcare conflicts because the doctor doesn't want to honor the patient's advance directive, or when the family is saying to the doctor, "Ignore what my dad wrote and do what I want you to do." As a clinical bioethicist, these things are so frustrating because I know that this patient took the time to meet with his lawyer, to write his advance directive, to give copies to his family and his doctors, and still it fails him. He thought he was safe, but it ended up that it was a false sense of security. Today, I'm going to share with you a case where I was called in as an expert witness because the patient's advance directive was failing him both in the hospital and in the courts. Before we begin, I understand that in your state, you may call the advance directive a healthcare directive, a living will, or some other name. For the purposes of our conversation today, I'm going to call it an advance directive. I also understand that you may call the decision maker an agent, a proxy, a surrogate decision maker, a durable power of attorney for healthcare. But again, for the purposes of today, I'm going to call that person the decision maker. I also understand that you may have one of the new forms for orders for other life-sustaining treatments in your state. It's most commonly called POLST, Physician Orders for Life-Sustaining Treatment. In your state, it might be called MOST, MOST, POST, or something else. But all of these forms do the same thing. They help to explain quickly across the care settings what the patient would want. For more information about where your state is in the legislative process, go to www.polst.org. This new form does not replace an advance directive. It works as a supplement with the document. Now, even though I won't be talking about these forms specifically today, the same principles will apply. What I will be discussing today is the following. We will be looking at specific ways an advance directive fails in the hospital setting. We will also look at how to create a document that is personal, meaningful, and will work in that healthcare setting. I'm going to discuss CPR, feeding tubes, and other life-sustaining treatments from a medical point of view. I'm going to provide you conversation tools to help you facilitate these difficult end-of-life discussions. I'm also going to give you insights regarding the unexpected financial costs at the end of life. We're going to review an algorithm to help your client's decision maker to make better medical decisions when the time comes. And we're going to look at how to make it easier for both the decision maker and the doctor to honor the advance directive. Before we begin, you may want to download or print out the following documents from your DVD. My own quality of life statement, a template to use to create a quality of life statement, my guidance for my decision maker worksheet, a list of questions to ask when making a medical decision, my crisis worksheet, an algorithm for evaluating treatment options when you know the patient's long-term wishes, 3 easy-to-understand CPR articles, what I want the doctors to know about honoring my faith and culture handout, and steps to follow when having my doctor review my advance directive handout. I have also given you an insider's guide to filling out the advance directive and a quick tips. I encourage you to share these documents with your clients so they begin from a place of information and education so they can make better documents. And then they can share the same packet of information with their own decision makers. Now let's begin. What do people want? Well, a lot of people say to me, I hope I die in my sleep. And some people say to me, I hope I get hit by a bus. But I never hear anyone tell me, I hope I die a terrible death after a long illness. But the reality is, only 10% of people die suddenly, and 90% do die after that long illness. This makes the advance directive you are creating incredibly important because it isn't just about the patient's end-of-life wishes, it's about living with a long-term disability. Your client's advance directive may end up speaking for your client for years and years. And because of this, we've got to get it right. So let me begin and tell you about the case of Mr. A. Mr. A is a 68-year-old man with end-stage Alzheimer's, a feeding tube, and an advance directive that isn't working. But he isn't just a patient. He is a man who loves to go out and hang out with his buddies. He's a bit feisty and difficult to live with, but he adores his grandkids, and he loves to listen to all sorts of music. But when I met him, he was suffering from all that comes with advanced Alzheimer's. When I arrived in court, there were 4 lawyers there. His lawyer, the conservator's lawyer, the daughter's lawyer, and the girlfriend's. They were all fighting with each other, but nobody seemed to be fighting for Mr. A and his wishes to be honored. This wasn't okay. It should have been better. What I'm going to do today is I'm going to show you piece by piece how his document failed him and how it could have been written differently. The first reason it failed him is because it didn't sound like him. Mr. A had said many times, "If I am ever in a wheelchair, just shoot me." This was a man who didn't want to be disabled in any way. But his advance directive was written in legal language, which then was misinterpreted by the medical professional who only speaks medical language, and nowhere in his advance directive was anything that was personal or human language. And without a personalized advance directive, this created a lot of confusion and doubt. When the doctor asked the family, "Is this what he meant?" the family said, "I don't know. It doesn't sound like him. I'm not sure." Now, if his lawyer had had Mr. A say something like, "Just shoot me," it would have been very clear what Mr. A thought about living with a disability. To solve this problem, I have people create a personal quality of life statement. This helps translate the advance directive into language that both the doctors and the family can understand. So let's go ahead and take a look at the first 2 documents, my own quality of life statement and the template to use to create a quality of life statement. Now what I have done is I have actually attached my advance directive quality of life statement to a basic state form. The reason I've done this is because I know doctors prefer documents that they're familiar with, documents that they've seen many times. Now, you don't have to do that. You can still write your own legal document, but I would suggest you take a look at the format and structure of your state's forms to make it easier for the doctors. In the quality of life statement, there are 9 sections or questions. People don't have to answer everything. They should write what's important to them. Let me go through these sections. Number 1, types of illnesses where this advance directive would apply. 2. What is important to me or what makes my life worth living? 3. What conditions would I find horrible to live with, or what would be a fate worse than death? 4. What would be an acceptable level of better, or I wouldn't like it, but I would be willing to live with? 5. CPR, ventilator, and feeding tube preferences. 6. What would be important to me as I die, or what's a good death in my opinion? 7. What do I want the doctors to know about honoring my religious and cultural beliefs both when I am sick and or dying? 8. Reassurances for my decision maker. And 9. Additional guidance for the doctor. Let's begin with Section 1. In Section 1, we review types of illnesses where this advance directive would apply. How Mr. A's document failed him. His form said, if I am PVS, or persistent vegetative state, or dying, then, but he didn't address Alzheimer's or any other type of illness or injury, so when the doctors read the form, they said, well, he's not PVS, and he's not dying, so it doesn't apply. And then the courts did the same thing. They just ignored that his preferences were there, but he just didn't say all the different kinds of ways he might have lost his ability to function. It's not what he meant, and that is one way that it really got misinterpreted. So how did I solve this? In my advance directive quality of life statement, I addressed types of illnesses where this advance directive would apply. Let me read to you. I can never list every type of disease that might make me begin to lose my mental capacity, but the list might include, and is not limited to, all types of dementias, stroke, brain injury, mental illness, anoxic event, etc. The reason I said all types of dementias is because if you just say Alzheimer's, then it won't apply to vascular dementia or Lewy body dementia or any of those other cognitive impairments. It would be best to use the umbrella term dementias. The other term, anoxic event, what that means is that's when your brain is without oxygen. So you may have had a near drowning, or you may not have had CPR quickly enough, and so now you have brain damage. So I just wanted to kind of give an open-ended view of all the different ways that I might lose my mental capacity. Let me continue reading. I don't have to be completely out of it, like being in a persistent vegetative state, coma, or minimally conscious state for this document to go into effect. And I don't have to be terminal. Now, others might not add that, but that's what I wanted to say. The point is, I don't want to have my life prolonged or sustained if my brain no longer works well enough for me to enjoy what is important to me. Did you notice how I said that? The point is, people will read this and say, yep, that sounds like Vicky, and that will be a good thing. Let's move on to Section 2. Section 2 is what is important to me, or what makes my life worth living. How his document failed him. It said, if I am not enjoying life, then. But it didn't address what makes his life enjoyable. And unfortunately, this vague statement was misinterpreted dramatically. The court decided that not suffering 1 hour a day was enough for him to enjoy his life and for the treatments to continue. Now, I don't know about you, but I never say, wow, I only suffered 23 hours today. Boy, am I having a great day. No, and I don't think that's how you would define enjoying your life. Mr. A meant something specific, but he didn't define his term. And so we've got to be very careful, and you'll see this in other points along the way today. We've got to define our terms. So how did I solve this? I answered that question. What is important to me, or what makes my life worth living? Let me read to you. I want to be able to make a difference in the world. I want to be able to communicate with those I love. I want to receive the joy that comes from personal relationships, to have some independence, to be able to give love, not just receive people's kindness. And I don't want to be a burden on my family or friends, financially, emotionally, or physically. You will find it fascinating to discover all the different ways your clients will tell you what makes their life worth living. I'd like to share with you a few of the things that others have told me. One woman I know, she said, I just want to be able to run and play. She would hate to be trapped in a bed and not still be able to be physical. Another person said, I need to be able to go out in the sunshine and feel the fresh air. Even if I'm in a bed and you roll me out there, that would be okay. Many people say, I need a spiritual life. I need to be able to say my prayers. And most people say, I want to still recognize my family. It is not for me or the doctors or the courts or anyone else to say what makes your life worth living. That's for you to decide. And as a bioethicist, if you tell me what you want, I'm going to advocate for it, whether I agree with it or not, because it is your life and your body. This is what advanced directives are supposed to do. They're supposed to help us hear the person's voice. What I'd like you to do is to stop for a moment and write down some of the things that would be important to you. What makes your life worth living? And then we'll move on to section 3. Section 3. What conditions would I find horrible to live with, or what would be a fate worse than death? How his document failed him. He didn't say what types of conditions would be horrible to live with, or how long to give him to recover so he could enjoy life. The only thing he said was, if I am dying. But dying has a lot of different interpretations. It might mean having a terminal illness. I'm dying in the next couple months or 3 years from now. Or if you work in hospice, the words actively dying means that the person will be dying 24 to 48 hours from now. Or it might mean qualifying for hospice. We say that the person will probably die in the next 6 months, therefore they qualify for hospice. Now, for Mr. A, qualifying for hospice was going to be a problem because of his feeding tube. It was interfering with the natural progression of his Alzheimer's disease. For most people, when they have end-stage Alzheimer's, they begin to lose the ability to swallow and to remember how to chew. And so they start to lose weight, which, when they've lost enough weight, gives them a qualification for hospice. But because Mr. A had a feeding tube, he was actually gaining weight, and he was not going to be able to receive those benefits. How did I solve this? I answered those questions. What would be a fate worse than death? But first, I clarified what I was willing to live with in the short term, a bad condition, if it helped me reach my long-term goals. Let me read it to you. Please, give me the chance to recover if recovery is possible. But if I'm not recovering to a level of functioning that I would think is worthwhile, whether terminal or not, then choose comfort care and hospice, which I understand will lead to my death. All of the following conditions do not have to be present at the same time for the decision to be made to allow me to die from my illness or injury. any one of these conditions may be sufficient enough to change the course of treatment from prolonging my life to allowing a natural death. Now, the reason I use the language allow a natural death is because this is a new term being used in hospitals. In the past, we've walked in to speak with a family about CPR, and the doctor says, "We're not going to give your mom CPR because it won't work." And the family's upset. "What? You're not going to give my mom CPR?" So we've changed this dialogue, and we walk in and we say, "What would your mom want? Would she want us to allow her to have a natural death?" So by saying allow a natural death, it softens the tone of the conversation, and it actually creates a much more realistic conversation about how the person wants to die. So let me continue reading. Conditions I would not want to live with include and are not limited to not being able to communicate by voice, computer, sign language, or gestures. Not recognizing my loved ones. I couldn't bear for my husband, Ed, to come and visit me in the dementia unit and see me becoming violent or not recognizing him or hitting on another man because I am so confused. That would be a fate worse than death. I wouldn't want to be wandering around aimlessly. I wouldn't want suffering that isn't necessarily pain-related, or significant pain that cannot be controlled, or significant pain that requires so much medicine that I'm sleeping all the time. And don't park me in a skilled nursing facility hallway and tell me that this is a good quality of life. It is not. I would not want to live in a skilled nursing facility or subacute facility permanently with a cognitive impairment. Now, a subacute facility is a place where people can live long-term on ventilators. They take care of people with more significant medical needs. Let me continue. Nursing homes create such a sadness in me every time I have visited or stayed overnight with a loved one. I am too empathetic and taken people's suffering too easily to be in that environment. It would destroy me long term. I would rather die. A short-term stay in a SNF, rehab, or subacute facility is okay if I can recover to a life that I would consider worth living. And I understand that with certain types of traumatic brain injuries, the period of recovery may take longer to evaluate whether recovery is possible or not. But if it looks like I am not recovering, then no thank you. What I'd like you to do is to stop for a moment and write down any thoughts you have regarding what would be a fate worse than death for you. So what do other people say would be a fate worse than death? Well, many people say to me, there is no thing like that. All life is precious. It's God's will to decide when I die. Just laying there would be okay because I'm alive. Great. Thank you for telling me. I'll know what to do for you. A relative of mine said, "Oh, it would be okay if I couldn't recognize people because every day I would make new friends." I loved this. It was such a different perspective. Now, it's not what I would want, but how wonderful that she sees her life and her disability in that way. It was beautiful. Another person told me I would just say suffering. But in that situation, I needed to clarify with that person, what does suffering look like for you? What kinds of suffering? And this is something that the judge actually asked me. The judge said, "What is suffering?" And I explained that it could be pain. It could be a spiritual crisis. It could be emotional suffering, existential suffering. There are so many ways that we can define suffering. So you've got to have your client tell you what he or she means. Let me tell you two others, which will demonstrate the role of this section 3 and the next section 4. Here we go. Paralyzed with no means of communication with my caretakers. Of course, with all the sewing and knitting I do, just losing a hand would kill me. Now, I would need to check with her. Does she mean kill me if I can't sew? I don't think so, but again, clarify. This one I loved. I think a fate worse than death would be if my brain could no longer register love. If I could no longer connect in any way with those I loved. Losing my speech, mobility, or independence would be horrible, but I don't think those would be a fate worse than death. There are so many ways to connect without those things. This is a perfect example of what we're going to talk about now in Section 4. Section 4. What would be an acceptable level of better? I wouldn't like it, but I would be willing to live with. Let me tell you what I've written. I could accept being in a wheelchair or on a ventilator as long as I have my cognitive abilities. The reason I could tolerate a bad physical condition is because I could still make a difference by talking and laughing with my family and friends, writing articles and supporting others in need. But once my cognitive abilities are damaged to a certain level, then there is no acceptable level of better. The goal of sections 2, 3, and 4 is to clarify the boundaries of what is acceptable for this person. Put into simpler terms, we could say, here is what I like, here is what I hate, and here's what I could live with. You might want to stop and write down your thoughts regarding what you would be willing to live with. Section 5. What would be important to me as I die, or what is a good death in my opinion? If you noticed, in the previous sections, they weren't about dying, they were about living with a cognitive impairment. In this section, we will address what is important to your client at the end of his or her life. I've brought you 2 tools to help you facilitate these conversations. The first is the Go Wish cards. This is a wonderful tool to help you have those conversations. Let me show you how it works. There's a deck of cards with things like, I want to have my family with me, I want to be free from pain, I want to pray, all sorts of meaningful personal things that might make a difference when somebody's dying. The way the game works is you have your client create 3 piles, what I do want, what I don't want, and what's okay with me. And there might be a 4th pile, I don't know yet, I'll have to think about it. What I've found is even for people who don't want to really speak about these wishes, they're willing to play the game and they'll silently go like this. Yes, no, yes, and they'll make their piles. The other thing you can do is to go on their website, gowish.org, and have your clients play the game online. The nice thing about that is you can then print off their answers and attach it to their advanced directive and give copies to their family and friends. The other thing I want to show you is the Thinking Ahead project. This is designed to help you have conversations with people with developmental disabilities. Now, you're probably not going to have this whole booklet's conversation with that person during your office time. You'll send it home and have their caregiver talk through and write down their preferences. You can get this for free in many different languages from the California Post Association. Their website is coalitionccc.org, the Coalition for Compassionate Care of California. This is wonderful. I encourage you to take a look at it. So, what would be important to me as I die? Let me read you some of them. I would prefer to die at home, but I realize that sometimes a person needs to die somewhere else, so I accept that. And the reason I accept that is because I don't want my family to feel badly about putting me in that nursing home when they can't take care of me. I'm too sick, my needs aren't being met, and I need to go somewhere with a higher level of care. I would also like to have my family and friends with me if they would like to be there. But I understand that sometimes people can't be there when somebody's dying because it's too difficult. That's okay. I don't want to be a burden. I would also like to die with reasonable pain control. For the days leading up to my death, I would be willing to tolerate a small amount of pain if that allowed me to have meaningful time with family and friends. But at the end, there had better be no pain and definitely no air hunger. That doesn't mean ventilator support. It means manage my air hunger with medications. Let me explain what I mean. What is air hunger? Air hunger is just what it sounds like. You're starving for air, you're gasping for breath, and it is really scary. People are very panicky when they're not getting enough air in. And when they come into the emergency room, because of this panic, they often get put on a ventilator, even if they didn't want it. Because at that moment they say, give me the air, and they put them on the ventilator. That's not what I want. I know that in hospice, on a regular basis, we manage air hunger in people's homes with medicines. We have medicines that keep them calm and medicines that help them breathe. Now, I found this interesting research study that they asked emergency room doctors, what would you want if you came into the emergency room with air hunger? And the ER doctors said, manage me with medications. Don't put me on a vent. They asked these same doctors, what do you do for patients who come in with air hunger? And they said, well, yeah, we just put them on a ventilator. This is so representational of what's happening in healthcare. The professionals know what these choices represent, and that putting someone on a vent creates a cascade of other decisions. You put them on the ventilator, they then end up in the intensive care unit, which then leads to a tracheotomy and a feeding tube and a very different living and dying experience, versus manage their air hunger, keep them comfortable, and allow them to have a peaceful death. I know that I want a certain trajectory for my decisions. And doctors also know that a lot of these resources we're spending on people at the end of life, they're not making a difference. They're not changing the outcome. So speaking of resources and money, let's talk about the unexpected costs at the end of life. Now, I realize you're not going to include this in the advance directive, but I wanted to give you this information to help you be a better advocate for your client regarding what they're going to need as they're getting toward the end of life. People think that hospice will provide 24-hour care in the home, but hospice just sends somebody in for an hour here, an hour there. The family is responsible for that day, night, and day care. When will the patient need this? A couple different reasons they're going to need 24-hour care. When the patient needs care and the family isn't getting any sleep, or when the patient becomes bedbound or is unconscious and they're not safe to be left home alone, or when it takes more than one person to lift or turn the patient, they're going to need more help. Now, how long might this last? It could be days, it could be years. I'm a hospice volunteer, and one of my hospice patients started hospice at age 99, and she lived to 105. During that time, her daughter, who was in her 70s, took care of her full time, and it was really overwhelming for her. What else isn't paid for by hospice? Medications that are life-prolonging. They only take care of the expenses that are palliative or comfort care. In my dad's situation, he had bone cancer, and he was on a very expensive medication that was keeping his bone cancer under control, and he had no pain, which was wonderful. But he needed hospice, so we put him on hospice, and he got all of those benefits, and I paid for that life-prolonging medicine. The other thing hospice doesn't pay for are supplies like Depends, bed pads, etc. Those will be the responsibility of the family. Some other unexpected costs at the end of life are when you need a lot of ambulance rides. One of the things we know is that the person may have only had to go to the hospital once a year for the last few years. But as they near the end of his or her life, the person needs an ambulance 3 or 4 times in just a couple of months. But many insurances do not cover the cost of ambulances, and at $800, $1,000 each, that can really add up. The patient may also need a trip to the hospital to have the pacemaker turned off. It's very hard to die if your pacemaker keeps trying to get your heart to start again. There may be family costs as well. The family member may be missing work to stay home with their loved one, or family is flying in to visit, or to take one more trip as a family, or for the funeral. So you may want to stop right now and write down any thoughts regarding what would be a good death for you, and any of the things you just realized, oh, I need to write that down and make sure I've left funds for those additional costs. And then we'll move on to the next section. Let's continue on with the next reason his document failed him. His lawyer wrote, "Do not do treatments that are futile." But his lawyer didn't understand that the word futile or futility can be interpreted 2 different ways in healthcare. There's physiological futility and qualitative futility. If a treatment is physiologically futile, it means it will not work. Just like an antibiotic will not cure a virus, or one chemo will not cure that cancer, but it will cure a different cancer. So there are many treatments that will not work, but they are offered. Now, you have to be asking yourself, why is this an issue? Why would doctors offer treatments that won't work? Well, a lot of these non-beneficial treatments are offered because the doctor doesn't want to give up hope, or the family doesn't want to believe that the person is dying, and they become very demanding and they threaten the doctor. If you don't give them this treatment, I'll sue you. I'm not saying that this is what should happen, but the reality is this is what does happen. If Mr. A's lawyer wanted to write down, "Don't do treatments that will not work," he should have written one of these 3 terms: medically inappropriate, medically ineffective, or non-beneficial. That would have helped. Now, qualitative futility asks, will the treatment achieve Mr. A's long-term goals or his quality of life goals? Let's look at the feeding tube. Was the feeding tube futile? Well, physiologically, no. It was working to keep him alive, just like it was designed to do. But qualitative futility? Yeah, it was definitely not meeting his quality life goals of achieving a chance to enjoy his life. Let me make this easier for you by showing you my algorithm for evaluating treatment options when you know the patient's long-term goals. If you haven't had a chance to download this document, you might want to stop for a moment and print it out. And I'm also going to go ahead and put it on the screen so you can see it as I discuss it. It starts out with 2 questions. What is the medical treatment being given or considered? And what are the patient's long-term goals? Or what would the patient want? What would the patient hate? And what could the patient live with? These 2 questions lead down to the primary question. Does the medical treatment have a reasonable chance of achieving the patient's long-term goals? And there are 3 options: yes, no, or maybe. If it's yes, it's working, then continue it or start it. If it's no, then stop or don't start it. If it's maybe, then we should try what's called a time-limited trial of the treatment. And then we need to stop and reevaluate. Is the treatment working toward the patient's long-term goals? If it's yes, continue. If it's no, then stop. It is not just about the person wanting the treatment or the treatment being a valid medical option. The decision has to meet both criteria. This concept is really going to help us when we begin to discuss CPR, feeding tubes, and ventilators in Section 6. Section 6. My preferences regarding CPR, being on a ventilator, and/or a feeding tube. How his document failed him. In his advanced directive, he did address CPR and ventilator support, but he did not address feeding tubes or TPN. TPN stands for total parenteral nutrition, which means being fed through an IV. Now, the only reason I bring this up is, in the past, TPN could only be given for short periods of time, so it wasn't a very life-sustaining treatment long-term, but now it can be given long-term. But for your purposes, you probably just want to write artificial nutrition and artificial hydration, and that'll cover it. Unfortunately, Mr. A didn't give us any written criteria regarding when these life-sustaining treatments would be wanted and when they would no longer be desired. So here's how I solved this. I contextualized the medical choices into how they would affect my life. Let me read this to you. My overall guidance is that if CPR, ventilator support, or a feeding tube/TPN can return me to what I would consider to be a meaningful existence, what is important to me, then please give me CPR, ventilator support, and/or a feeding tube/TPN. But there has to be value in these medical options and any other medical treatment choices that are being considered. Don't do things, including but not limited to antibiotics, etc., that are just to sustain my poor condition. I didn't want to try to list everything they could possibly give to me because that list would be really long and still not be inclusive. Let's back up for a moment. I said, but there has to be value in these medical options and any other medical treatment choices that are being considered. This is probably the most important sentence in my document. It has to bring me value. I also address long-term feeding tubes. Let me continue. I am not opposed to living with a feeding tube or TPN if it gives me many years of being able to enjoy what is important to me. But if the feeding tube or TPN is just to sustain my miserable condition, or what I would consider horrible, then don't put it in or give me feedings through it, and if it's already in, take it out. Okay, if I'm on hospice and the feeding tube gives you access for administering the pain and suffering meds I need, then you can leave it in, but don't put food or additional liquids in it. The reason I said that is because sometimes you need to put a little liquid in to move the medicine down the tube, but I don't want people putting additional stuff down it. That would not be meeting my goals. The feeding tube, like all medical decisions, needs to create value in my life, not just sustain my life. And the feeding tube, like the ventilator, represents much more. It's not just about putting in the tube, it's about living with the tube. And in general, the reason they get put in so quickly and easily is because it is easy. It takes about 15 minutes. There are very few risks. They just pop it in and the patient's good to go. But the real risks come with living with a feeding tube. There's the risk of aspiration pneumonia. That's when you actually choke the food up and it goes out into your lungs. And that is miserable. That's terrible to have aspiration pneumonia. There's also the chance of pain and suffering around the skin where the tube went in or when they put the food in. there are a lot of other risks, especially for people who are end-stage Alzheimer's. We know that in end-stage Alzheimer's, you don't get any extra days. You don't live any longer with a feeding tube, and you suffer additional harms and dangers. We should not be putting them in people in end-stage Alzheimer's, but that's what Mr. A had. And if we just think about a person's quality of life, not being able to eat, for most people, that's a huge loss. So to answer the question, would I want a feeding tube? The answer is, it depends. And this is the problem with advanced directives. When you say yes feeding tube or no feeding tube, it doesn't allow for the situation to be different. Here's the rest of my answer. Yes, I want a feeding tube if I have esophageal cancer and I can't swallow anymore, but I can still go back to my life. Yeah, I'm going to have to put up with having a feeding tube, but that's okay because I get my life back. But absolutely no if I have end-stage Alzheimer's. It's not getting me what I want, so no thank you. So this is why we have to qualify in what situations would I want it and in what situations would it not be desired. Let's move on to an article that I want to tell you about called How Doctors Die. This article was in the Saturday Evening Post, and it's written by Dr. Ken Murray earlier this year in March of 2013. Now, this article created quite a stir in the healthcare setting because it's not something doctors usually discuss publicly. The way doctors die is different from how you and I die. The reason is, doctors have a more realistic expectation regarding what medicine can actually accomplish. They want treatments that have a reasonable chance of working. Now, of course, I might want to define that word. Doctor, what do you mean by reasonable? 20%, 50%? What do you mean? Right? Because we want his advanced directive to work well too. In general, doctors understand the limitations of medicine. And with that in mind, let's talk about CPR. Your client can't begin to make an informed decision without knowing more about CPR. I have given you 3 articles for you to share with your clients, and then they should share them again with their decision makers. What I'd like to demonstrate now is to show you how I discuss CPR and DNR, do not resuscitate, with families. The first thing I do is I ask the person or the family, what do you know about CPR? Here are the typical responses I get. They push on your chest, and I say, yes, that's right, chest compressions. They blow in your mouth, right, mouth-to-mouth resuscitation. And then they start hesitating. About half the people will say, oh yeah, I've seen it on TV. They go like that and they use those paddles and jumpstart your heart. And I'm like, yeah, absolutely, they do that. And then I say, what else? And now I have a blank look. The only time people know what comes next is if they're already medical people. So then I need to clarify what else is included. Medication given through an IV to help jumpstart the heart, and intubation and ventilation. Intubation is when they put a tube down your throat to help the air get in, and ventilator is a breathing machine or a respirator, because people use different terms. Now this is when seniors will say to me, wait a minute, Vicki, wait a minute. I want the chest compressions and I want you to blow in my mouth, but I don't want to be hooked up to a machine. And I ask them, didn't the doctor tell you? And they're like, no, we never knew it included those other things. We might have made a different decision. That's why you've got to tell people the whole truth. You also have to explain to them that CPR doesn't work in real life like it does on TV. On TV, research has shown it works about 75% of the time, and people wake up very healthy from it, like this. Ah, that's how it looks like on TV. But the reality is, The real survival rate in a hospital with somebody that is fairly healthy is 15 to 17%. And if the person has metastatic cancer, multi-organ system failure, is very, very sick, the chance of it working is 0 to 1%. This is very different. The public thinks it works 75% of the time, but the reality of their loved one with metastatic cancer surviving CPR is 0 to 1, and it's really probably 0. The other thing that patients don't understand is that they may come back to life in a worse condition, physically and mentally. The two statistics that I share with people are the first two listed on the screen. I'm going to leave the other ones up there for a moment, but I don't usually use them because it's too much information. The first is leaving the hospital with your brain back to where it was before the code, 7%. What that means is 93% of the time after CPR, all of us, healthy or sick, will have some form of brain damage. 97% of the time, you will have rib fractures. That's a lot. People know that they're going to break your ribs when they start CPR. Now, for someone who's healthy and it gives them a chance to come back and live their life, they're 15 to 17%, okay, I can live with some broken ribs. I want my CPR. But in somebody who's frail and old with osteoporosis, this is a terrible way to die. And that's the last thing I tell people about, that the way they talked about what is important as I die, they did their Go Wish cards, none of that will be available to them if they die by CPR. CPR is when strangers are straddling you on the bed, pushing on your chest, your family is in the waiting room, and you're gone before people can say goodbye. That's not how most people want to leave this world. So you've got to tell people the whole truth, and they can choose what's best for them. I always remind people, I want CPR, I'm healthy enough, but the time will come when I'm old and frail, I don't want it. Now, after I've told people all of this, there are a few people that will still say, I want my 0 to 1% chance. I'm willing to come back with a terrible brain injury. Great. Thank you for telling me. Let's write this down so we make sure we honor your wishes. That's what this is about. Give them good information so they can make better decisions. I would now like to share with you some research that was done at Harvard in 2007. They asked healthy seniors, what would you like if you had advanced dementia and were living in a skilled nursing facility? Would you want everything done, some interventions, comfort care, or unsure? And the way they answered it, 50% said comfort care, 21% said everything done, 18% said some interventions, and 11% said unsure. Now, before I tell you what happened next, I do want to clarify that I need you to not keep saying, do you want everything done in your advanced directive documents? If you do want to use a phrase like everything done, please say something like, do you want everything that is medically appropriate to be done? That will help lessen the chance of them getting things that won't work or they just cause a lot of harm. All right, so the rest of the story. They then showed these healthy seniors a video of a person living in a skilled nursing facility with advanced dementia. It wasn't a scary video, it wasn't a horrible video, it was just a normal day. Here's what happened when they asked those same questions. 89% said comfort care, 0% said everything done, and 11% said some interventions or unsure. This was a dramatic change. It went from 50% of people wanting comfort care to 89%. And the reason that they changed their minds is because when these seniors saw what they were choosing, they chose differently. So it really makes a difference If you give people better information, they're going to make better decisions. I would like to share with you one other resource that you can use to help demonstrate this point. This is called Consider the Conversation. It's a wonderful documentary that's been on PBS, and you can get it online at www.considertheconversation.org. This documentary focuses on making meaningful end-of-life decisions. It's not just about what medicine can do, but what medicine can do for you. It's just like when you talk to your clients about money. It's not about money itself, but what money can buy that client. For instance, what would be worth it to spend your money on at the end of your life? What would be valuable to you? Would you want to travel to see your family? Would you want to save more money so you could leave more to your kids? Or would you want to make sure you can pay for care at the house because you don't want your family burdened by your care? That's why I have long-term care insurance. I don't want my family burdened. So these questions are meaningful. We've got to put the medicine into the life that will experience it. I encourage you to look at Consider the Conversation, not just for yourself, but to share with your clients, and perhaps you'll want to host community viewing events. This is being done across the country. You invite the general public in, you show this wonderful movie, you have a panel to discuss it afterwards, and it says to the community, you matter to me. I want you to have meaningful and personalized advanced directives that will get you what you want at the end of life. Before we move on to choosing your decision maker, I wanted to let you know about one other document that you could recommend to your clients. Now, this isn't a legal document, and it's not something you have to spend a lot of time on. It's a care preferences document which says, this is what I would like on a day-to-day basis when I'm receiving care either at home or in a facility. Now, one of my favorite elder law attorneys, Rebecca Goldfarb in Los Angeles, she begins her conversations with this question. Do you prefer your feet under the covers or outside of the covers? I love this question because people have strong opinions about this. They definitely want one or the other. For me, I want the covers loose so I can put my feet out when they're hot and in when they're cold. I don't know what you want, but please write it down because you don't want to be in the nursing home and have some well-intentioned nurse tuck you in when you don't want that. The nice thing about asking these kind of personal, day-to-day questions is it sets a tone that what the patient, your client, wants is personal and important, and it needs to be written down. You may want to stop and take a few notes about what would be important to you. How do you like your coffee? When do you like to wake up in the morning? What would make your day-to-day care more comfortable and joyful for you? And then we'll move on to section 7. Section 7, picking the right decision maker. One of the most common reasons the advance directive fails in the hospital is because of a bad or uninformed decision maker. Because I want your clients to choose wisely, I have given you 3 documents: my guidance for my decision makers worksheet, my quick tips handout, and my insider's guide for filling out your advance directive for a more detailed discussion of these issues. The goal is to have a decision maker who is well informed because it gives that decision maker a chance to opt out. I don't want to be in charge of these decisions. I don't agree with these decisions. Because you don't want your client to end up in the emergency room with a decision maker who doesn't want to be there or who won't do a good job. I have given you these documents in Word because that way you can modify them into legally appropriate language for your state. Change advanced directive to living will or whatever else you need to do. Now, I'm not going to read everything on these forms to you, but I do want to mention a few of the other resources that I've referenced in my guidance for my decision maker. The first is a list of questions to ask when making medical decisions. This can be a great resource for the decision maker who feels unsure or has never been in this experience and doesn't know, what do I ask? This can be a guide for them to feel like they're getting the information they need. And because medical decision making is so stressful, please consider giving your clients a copy of my crisis worksheet. This could really protect that decision maker from the strong emotions that get in the way of healthcare decisions. Most importantly, teach them to use substituted judgment when making the decisions. On the screen, I've shown you the decision-making framework. It includes the 3 ways that we make healthcare decisions in hospitals: autonomy, substituted judgment, and the best interest standard. Autonomy means that the person can speak for him or herself. It's also how the advanced directive should be perceived. The person wrote the advanced directive and is speaking directly through it to the healthcare professional. The second best option is substituted judgment. That's when a loved one will be saying, I think what she would want, and they're speaking with the person's values, but not necessarily directly with their words. The last and worst option is the best interest standard. That's when we know little or nothing about the patient, and we have to guess what he or she would want. That's the worst way to make decisions. That's why people really need these forms. On the second page of the Guidance for My Decision Maker worksheet, it reviews the substituted judgment process. It explains that you're supposed to ask yourself, what would my loved one be saying if he or she could speak right now? What does his culture or his religion or his values say about this healthcare decision? What has he or she said in the past? What would be important to consider? There are all sorts of ways that we can look at this, including things that are also referenced on that list of questions when we're making medical decisions. Now, I'll tell you about a nurse that I know. She told me this story the other day because she was so upset. She had been at home speaking with her husband, and she said to her husband, boy, I would never want to live like this patient in the hospital that I'm caring for right now. I would want you to pull my plug. And the husband said, I couldn't do that. I could never do that. And she's like, no, but that's what I would want. You're supposed to do that. And the husband's like, no, I couldn't. The very next day, she rewrote her advanced directive. Thank goodness she found out that the decision maker she had chosen couldn't honor her wishes. That's why it's important to include the decision maker in the process early on. And that's why I've written Section 7, Reassurances for My Decision Maker. Not every decision maker is bad or uninformed. Sometimes it's just that their emotions get in the way. So let me read to you what I've said in my document. You are allowed to make the best decisions you can based on the circumstances and what you know at the time. You do not need to know for certain or absolutely that you have all the answers. The decision doesn't have to be perfect. Use your heart and your head. I trust you to do the best you can. Ed, you don't have to go into super perfectionist mode. Now, let me tell you a story about that last sentence. I had written something different, and I showed it to my husband, and he's like, what do you mean? What do you mean by this? And I said, well, I don't want you to go into that super research mode where, like when you're researching long-term care insurance for us, You got like every piece of information out there. I don't expect you to do that. That would be too much to put on you. So he said, write this, Vicki. Ed, you don't need to go into super perfectionist mode. How wonderful. I've actually written down his words to help him understand what I need from him and to give him some support. I just love that. So let me read the rest of this to you. Ed, if you need some time to make peace with what has happened, then you can take the time you need. I don't want the decision to feel rushed or uninformed, which would cause you a lifetime of regret. That would be terrible. So now, let's look at how substituted judgment affected Mr. A's case. Now, in this situation, Mr. A's document didn't fail him. The healthcare system failed him by not having his decision maker use substituted judgment. And the judge didn't use substituted judgment. The judge decided to use that least preferable standard, the best interest standard, in this situation. This was probably the most frustrating thing for me in the courtroom. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. These standards are not just something we use in medicine. There is legal precedence in our famous health law cases about respecting the person's right to request and refuse treatments. But the court ignored it. It wasn't right. But many courtrooms across the country are not ignoring this issue. There is a growing trend for hospitals and doctors to be held liable for allowing a decision maker to go against the patient's stated wishes or the advance directive. Now, I'm not surprised that these issues are going to the court. I've been sitting in rooms where the family will say to me, let's keep him alive because I'm living off of his disability checks. Or let's hurry this up because we want his inheritance. Or let's keep him alive because I've been a bad daughter and we need to miraculously wake him up so I can repair my relationship. It's not supposed to be about everyone else's agenda. It's supposed to be about the patient. So let me share with you 3 brief court cases that are beginning to set precedents across the country. The first is in regarding Levatas in New York. The court removed a demanding surrogate because the demands went against the patient's stated wishes in the advance directive, and the surrogate failed to appreciate her mother's true medical condition. The next case is Cardoza versus USC University Hospital. There were 3 sisters. One was determined to be the surrogate decision maker, and one of the other sisters sued both the hospital and her sister because the sister who was assigned to be the surrogate was not complying with the advance directive. The hospital lost because they should have removed this bad decision maker. The final case I want to tell you about is Bernstein versus the Superior Court, California. A conservator was replaced because of demands for aggressive treatment that offered no benefit and significant suffering. So what I'm considering doing in my next advance directive is I'm actually thinking about putting in the probate codes and references to the famous health laws that support what I'm either asking for or refusing. Now, I don't know if your state has strong probate codes regarding healthcare decision-making. Some states do not. But if yours does, you may decide to put little references along the way to help give this document more legal weight. It might inspire the doctors to listen and honor the advance directive better. So we've now talked about whether the decision maker will honor the advance directive. Let's move on to Section 8 and talk about whether the physician will honor the advance directive and what we can do about it. Section 8. What do I want the doctors to know about honoring my religious and cultural beliefs, both when I am sick and or dying? So it isn't just about will the doctor honor the advance directive? The real question is, will the doctor read the advance directive you wrote? Not if it's really long. I've seen doctors look at a 23-page advance directive and say, I don't have time for this, and they put it down. Now, eventually, the social worker will come by and pick it up and read it, but until that time happens, nobody's honoring the patient's wishes, and it's not effective communication. It didn't get the job done. The other problem is if it's written in too much legalese. Mr. A's had that trouble. The other thing that doctors don't like is when what's being requested is not medically appropriate. It's not reasonable in the context of medicine. So just like making sure that the decision maker is informed ahead of time, it's also important to check with your client's doctor to see, does this make sense medically? What I recommend before you have your client sign the advance directive is to have them talk to their doctor and to ask these 3 questions. Number 1, does what I've written down make sense to you? You want the doctor to explain it back in his or her own words to make sure that it's really been understood. Number 2, is there anything else I should consider including based on my illness or injury that I haven't thought about yet? There may be future complications that the patient isn't aware of that may need to be addressed in the advance directive. And question number 3, will you be willing to honor my wishes? And to follow up with that, I understand that you may not be the doctor who will be taking care of me in the hospital, but can you please make sure to let the other doctor know what I would want? This is going to become a big issue. The primary care doctor is often not the person who's caring for the person in the hospital setting. We've got to encourage the primary to still participate in communicating the patient's wishes. Unfortunately, this became an issue for Mr. A because his doctor came from a different religion than his. The reality is, we have physicians from all over the world, and the patients, they're just as diverse. So if your client's beliefs are important to him or her, have your client write them down. You can do that using the document I've given you for Section 8 called What Do I Want the Doctors to Know About Honoring My Religious or Cultural Beliefs, Both When I Am Sick and or Dying? For most people, they know their beliefs. They may not need to even look at this document. But for others, reading through this may help them understand how their beliefs may affect their healthcare decisions. Now, not every healthcare conflict is about religion or culture. So your client may want to write down some additional guidance for the doctor. Section 9, Additional Guidance for My Doctor. Now, some people, they'll just write, thank you in this section. Thank you, doctors and nurses, for taking care of me. Thanks, because I can't tell you, but I really, really appreciate you. What I ended up doing in this section is I wanted to define my expectations of the doctor's role. So here's what I wrote. For you, doctor, your role is to give my decision maker as much information as you can so he or she can make an informed decision. I encourage you to share your wisdom, guidance, and experience, but ultimately, it is my decision as expressed through my decision maker and this document. Remember, this document is an act of autonomy and should not be ignored by my decision makers, other family members, doctors, or worst case, the courts. Now you can imagine why I wrote that last sentence. I wrote that because of Mr. A. So what happened to Mr. A? Well, not a lot changed regarding his medical treatments, but the conservator did address some of his quality of life needs. They got him a new boombox because his was broken and he wasn't getting to enjoy the music that he loved. Then, after about 8 months, Mr. A's condition worsened and he was taken back to the hospital. And he got a different doctor assigned to his care. This doctor had no religious conflicts, and he took the time to have a meaningful end-of-life conversation with the conservator. He explained what medicine could do and not do for Mr. A at this time. And the doctor encouraged the conservator to use substituted judgment. And because of this, the conservator felt confident about making these end-of-life decisions, and he agreed to have the feeding tube removed and to put Mr. A on hospice. Mr. A died peacefully at home a few days later. I understand that creating this type of personalized document is a paradigm shift for the legal profession. You have been taught to focus on making sure the document will work in the courtroom. But what I need you to do is to make sure that the document will work in the hospital. Without that, the advance directive has the potential to create significant suffering and consequences for your client's life. We've got to get it right. I encourage you to take some time, go through what I've shared with you, and create a packet for your clients with this information in it. And you can share that with your clients, with their decision makers, and with your own family and friends. You may also want to rewrite your advance directive. The good news is, a good advance directive works really well in the hospital. Now, I have also included some additional resources for you at the end of this presentation, and what I am working on next is filming an easy-to-understand DVD regarding advanced care planning for the general public. Please let me know if you would be interested in this for your clients. Feel free to contact me with any questions or concerns you have. My email is kindethics@gmail.com. Thanks for listening and have a kind and respectful day.